Before we dive into object-oriented programming and start working on a larger project, I want to take a little bit of time to visit some intermediate PHP techniques that may fill in some of the gaps in your knowledge or may prove useful to you as we keep working. The first one of these I want to look at is variable variables. That is where the variable name is determined by a variable. Let's take a look. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up basic.html and I'm just going to do a save as on this file and save it as variables.php inside that B2B sandbox. Now we'll see the file is right here, and that's where we'll be keeping all of the files that we're working with. And I'll go ahead and just change the title to be variables just for reference. And then we can put our PHP code here in this body block. So we've talked about variables in the past, and you're very familiar with using them. Something like a equals hello, or we could have hello equals hello everyone. And we know how to do echo a or echo hello. To make it nice clean on the output, I'll go ahead and put some BR tags at the end of this. And I'll do another one here. So let's go ahead and load that up in a web browser just as a simple starting point. Localhost, there we are, B2B sandbox, and then it's variables.php. So there we are. Nothing that we don't already know how to do. But one of the questions that often comes up from students is, what if we don't know the variable name that we want to use? What if it's dynamically computed? How do we go ahead and evaluate that name and have a dynamic variable name? So in other words, we would not know hello. Instead, we would have a string, hello, and we would want to use that string to return the value of the variable hello. Well, it's really easy to do. All we have to do is echo and then $a. So what that's going to do is it's going to take the value of $a and come up with the string hello, and then use that with the second $sign to come up with the value of hello up here. It works exactly like you'd think. Let me go ahead and just put in another BR tag down here, and we can load that up, and we can see that that's true. That's all there is to being able to use dynamic variables. Now, you may not have a good picture in your head of when this kind of technique might be useful. So I've made just a real simple example that I want to show you. I've created a file called seats.php. You don't need to copy it down, but you can. It's real simple. It just simply takes a set of seats. Let's imagine it's a classroom, and the seats are labeled A, B, C, D, and E. And there's a different student sitting in each seat, and we've assigned those to a variable. So then, let's say maybe through a web form, I'm able to get together an array of the seats that I want. So seat A, seat C, and seat E are the students that I want to reference or talk about or work with. Those can be brought in as strings, stored in a database as strings, sent on a web form as strings. And then what we'll do is we'll say, well, for each student, as the variable seat, just a for each loop, take each one of those and do this dynamic variable retrieval. Variable variables. So in this case, you can see that it should return back to us the student sitting in the seat A, sitting in seat C, and seat E. So if we save that, if we come back over here and let's just try it real quick, seats.php, you'll see that's exactly what we get. So it's a real simple example, but you can see how this information here, right, these items, could be pulled from a database or sent in a URL or web form and then used to reference something else. So that's the kind of case where we'd use it. Now there's one catch to this. There's one thing that makes it tricky, and I want to make sure that I highlight it for you. And that is, if you think about the syntax here, you have to wonder, what would it do if we had something that was of this format? $sign, and then the variable name, and then the item that we want to reference inside an array. So in this case, we would be looking for the first item of an array. So with this syntax, would it mean to, number one, get the first element of the array, and then evaluate that answer dynamically? Or should it evaluate var dynamically and then look for the first element of that array? So it's not clear which one of these we should do first. This part is clear, but then it's not clear if we should do the 1 before the $sign or the $sign before the 1. So in order to make this unambiguous and to make it clear, what we do is use the curly braces. So in the first case, we would put the curly braces around the $sign var and the 1. In the second case, we just put it around the first variable to let it know that it should pull that in first, then evaluate the first element from there. So it works a lot like parentheses do in mathematical operations, telling us which one we want to do first. We're just using curly braces. And that's only when we're really working with arrays that it becomes a problem. Most times it won't come up, but I just wanted to make sure that I at least gave you that footnote so that you don't run into problems with it. And that's all there is to using variable variables. Let's take a look in the next movie at some more functions that we can use, this time working with arrays. In this movie, we're going to take a look at a couple of array functions that will allow us to put elements into and pull elements out of arrays, besides the techniques that we've already learned in the past. And I think these are going to be really useful for you. The first thing I want to do is go and open up that basic.html file again, and I'm just going to do another save as on it, and this time we're just going to call it array functions, and be sure to change it to .php. And then I'll change the title as well, array functions. And then we'll open up some PHP tags here and create ourselves a simple array. Numbers equal array 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's just a real simple array. Now we remember that instead of echoing back arrays, it's really useful if we can use print r to be able to see them instead. And that just gives us some nice formatting for those. But then right after it, I'll do an echo of 2 br tags, just so that we can separate it from everything that's going to come after it. Now the first technique I want to look at for pulling element out of an array is called shift. So array_shift is the function name, and it will shift the first element out of an array and return it. So in the case of the $a equals array shift numbers that I have there, you can almost imagine the first element being shifted out of the numbers array and being pushed and sent into that a, right? So it's shifting it from numbers into the variable that we have there. Now, we don't have to catch that. We could just run array shift without taking that value and putting it anywhere, and it would just continue to pull that first value out of it. So that's what it's doing really, is pulling that first element out. Whether we catch it in a variable or not is up to us. But we can go ahead and just do echo a colon, and then we'll put in the $a and put another br tag at the end of it. And then let's go ahead, just for good measure, and let's take a look at what numbers is again. We'll save that. We'll go back into Firefox, and we'll load up our sandbox page, array functions.php. And there we go. So you'll see that all the elements have just simply shifted over, so that now the array is only 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The 1 got pulled off and put into the variable of $a. Now we can do the reverse of this as well, which is unshift. So here I'm going to go ahead and just paste it in there so you can see it. It's the same thing. What we're going to do is call array unshift on numbers and provide it with the element that we want it to unshift, right? To do the reverse. So in this case, it'll put it back or push it on to the front of it. Now I'm also catching what that returns in the variable b. And what it's going to return is the element count. It's going to let us know how many elements are in there altogether. This might be useful for you or not. Again, you don't have to catch that value in a variable if you don't want to. But we can do the same thing and take a look just to see the difference. And sure enough, you'll see that it has 6 elements in the array now. And the first one is now first. It pushed it back onto the front of that. Now when I was talking about these, I talked about unshifting as being pushing an element onto the front of it, and shifting as popping an element out of it. Well, it turns out that there are 2 more functions that we can use that are called pop and push. So I'm just going to put those down here. I've got an HR tag that I just dropped in at the top to just separate the 2. Here's unshift up here at the top. And then I've got my new code, array pop and array push. And they work exactly the same, except that it pops the last element out of an array, not the first element, the last element, and returns it. And push does the same thing as unshift, but instead of doing it to the beginning of the array, it pushes the element onto the end of an array. And we can see this if we save our new file and we reload it in the browser. We'll now see, in this example, we pulled the 1 out and replaced it with first, and then first still persists all the way through here. It never gets pulled out. But the last element here, which was 6, gets removed and assigned to A, and then we put in the word last. We will push that onto the end. So shift and unshift at the beginning, push and pop at the end. So those are going to be the 4 that are going to allow us to put things into our array at the beginning and the end. And now we know we also have ways of assigning a value directly to a certain position. We saw those in the essential training. But this will allow us to say, yeah, whatever that value is at the end, not only do I want to retrieve it but I want to take it out of the array at the same time. And that's the thing that we couldn't do before. It both gives us the value and takes it out of the array at the same time. So those are going to be really useful for you, I think, when working with arrays. Now, I want to encourage you to take time to go through the PHP website, php.net, and look at the other functions that are available. Array shift is right here, but you'll see there are a lot of array functions here that you can use. And it's worth seeing how arrays can be powerful for you, because there's so many functions and so many different ways you can use them. I'm not going to try and cover them all because a lot of them are for rare cases. But I think that you might find array flip is something that helps you out of a jam that you're in, or array keys gives you what you're looking for. So take some time and explore all of these functions, build yourself your own page, start playing with them and see what they can do for you. But we're going to move on and we're going to take a look at dates and times in the next movie. One of the areas that perplexes a lot of beginning developers is working with dates and times. And that's partly because there are a lot of different ways to do it. And there are a lot of restrictions that depend on what kind of operating system you have, what kind of database you're using, and things like that just make it into a quagmire that's hard to wade through. So I'm going to give you some of the basics, some of the essential concepts behind it, and then you'll have to take a look at your system and see what works for you and do some research on ways to work around it. But this will at least give you the fundamentals. The first thing that we need to talk about is going to be epoch time, or the Unix timestamp. These are the same thing, and it's the time since the computer epoch began. So basically that's the time that Unix is going to use for its timestamp. And essentially, it's the number of seconds that have elapsed since January 1st of 1970 at midnight. That is the beginning of the computer epoch, according to the Unix timestamp. Since Unix is a file system, it must have seemed like common sense to the people developing it that a file could not be created before January 1st, 1970. The problem comes in when we start using these dates for things besides just files that have been created on a computer and start using them to keep track of birthdays and other calculations. Then we might have dates that go into the past. Now, if we have a 32-bit system, we're able to use dates from December 1902 to January 2037. 1970 plus 67 years to get to January 2037, or 67 years in the past to get to December 1902. And we do that by having a negative number, right? So we can count time forwards and backwards in negative numbers. But that also limits us, right? We still can't talk about some birthdays. We can't talk about dates that happened in history. We can't talk about future Social Security payments and things like that that might happen past 2037. So that's still a pretty limited range. So ultimately, what I think is going to happen is most systems are going to end up going to a 64-bit system of counting, because that will last for billions of years, and that'll take care of all of our needs. But we haven't done that yet. So on your system, you may be limited to 1902 to 2037, and if you're on a Windows machine or maybe some of the older Linux distributions, even dates prior to 1970 might give you a problem. I think I ran into that with the IIS database. Had problems with dates before 1970, and that's because Windows does. If you run into one of those problems, what are you going to do? Well, there's many choices, and it depends on your needs. You could store the date as a string, you could store the year separately from the date, or you could read up on one of the many hacks that are out there on ways to get around it, and the php.net website is full of a lot of those. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I don't want to focus on how you're going to work around the limitations of the computer you're working with, because you may get a shiny new computer tomorrow that handles all of it fine. Instead, I want to talk about the fundamental principles that we're going to be working with to create a Unix timestamp. And there's three ways that I want to look at to do that. The first is just time. Time with no arguments, just have the parentheses, and that will return the current time. And remember, that's the number of seconds since 1970. Okay, so that's the Unix timestamp. Now, the second is that we can make time, MK time, and we just need to provide it the number of hours, minutes, seconds, and then month, day, and year, and it will come back to us with a Unix timestamp, the number of seconds since 1970. Now notice the order there. It gets a little confusing for some people. It has the time first, hour, minute, second, and then it has month, day, year, which is sort of the American way instead of day, month, year like they do in other countries. So they're not in sort of ascending order or anything like that. It's a little bit of a jumble, but that's the order it's going to be: an hour, minute, second, month, day, year. And the last is string to time, strtotime. And then we provide any string to that function, and it will return a Unix timestamp to us, doing the best it can to generate that timestamp based on whatever's in that string. And we'll take a look at that. It's a pretty neat little function. So I'm going to open back up array functions, and I'm just going to do a save as on that file. And I'm going to call this date time underscore Unix, just to remember, because we're going to take a look at some other date time features later. And I'm going to take out all of this, and I'm going to call it dates and times Unix. Now the first way that we're going to make Unix time, we said, was just with the simple time command. So we'll do that with just echo time. We'll save that, and let's open that up in a browser and see what we get back. So we'll just open up a new window, and we'll go back to our sandbox and date time unix.php. And there we go. That's how many seconds have elapsed, right? And if we reload it, we can see all the seconds as they continue to count. Now we'll learn how to format that into something that looks nicer a little later. What we're interested right now is just getting that Unix timestamp. Because once we have a Unix timestamp, right, we can start to compare different timestamps. We can see when something happened 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, by comparing the current timestamp with the timestamp that we've stored, let's say, in a database or in a file or something like that. The second way we saw that we could make a timestamp is with maketime. And you'll remember that I told you that we have to provide a number of arguments here. We can do those as variables or just simply integers. So the first of those is going to be the hour, let's say 2, and the minute, 30, and the seconds will make 45. And then we need to put in the month and the date and the year. I'll put in 2009. Okay, semicolon there, and let's just, for good measure, let's put in BR tag at the end of this, just so it'll be on a new line. And let's reload it. There we go. So now you see the difference between the current time and the number of seconds there and this date in the future for 2:30 and 45 seconds on October 1st of 2009. And we can actually subtract the two and find out how many seconds there are in between and then convert that to a number of days and so on. Now, one note is that if you give something invalid to make time, it'll return false. So if you try to tell it, the date was February 30th, that's an invalid date and it would return false. Now, there's also another way that we can check whether dates are true that's worth mentioning, and that is with check date. And if we say, for example, echo check date 12/31/2000, and then we'll ask it to return true if that's a true date, or false if it's not. And we can do the same thing again. Let's go ahead and put our BRs in here just to make it nice and clean. But this time, let's ask it for February 31st and see whether that's a date. So if we come back and we reload those pages, you'll see that the first one is a date and the second one is not a date. So check date is also a helpful way to check whether a date is there or not. And last of all, I want us to take a look at that really cool function, the string to time. So let's say Unix timestamp equals string to time. And then we can put in a string that designates whatever time we'd like. Now, this is the cool part. For example, let's try now. And then I'm going to need to echo back that Unix timestamp since I set that as a value. And I'll append a BR after it. Let's load that up, see what we get. So there we are. Notice the times are the same at the top and the bottom. The time now, there's no difference whatsoever. And I could also put in something like 15 September 2004, and then come back, and there's the date stamp for that. I could also do September 15, 2004. And you'll see I get the same date stamp. So it's able to interpret these different ones. Let's try +1 day. That's tomorrow. Or we can say something like last Monday. So there's a lot of these different things that we can do that we can pass in as a string, and it's able to interpret what we mean. Now, it doesn't always 100% successful. You'll have to play around and try it out a little bit, but it does a pretty good job of parsing it out and figuring out what you mean and turning that into a Unix timestamp. So keep that in your back pocket because that's a really useful tool. Now that we know how to make Unix timestamps, in the next movie, we'll talk about how to make those into something that's human readable, how to go from a timestamp back to something that we can display that looks nice as output on our screen. In this movie, we're going to continue looking at dates and times. In the last movie, we saw how to build a Unix timestamp. And in this movie, I want us to take a look at how we can format that Unix timestamp. And there are two functions that are going to allow us to do that. The first function is date, and the second is strf time. Now you can either pronounce that string for time, string format time, but the idea is that we're taking a timestamp and turning it into a string. So in both cases, we're going to be formatting a Unix timestamp into something that's human readable, like November 13th, 2005, instead of however many seconds it's been since 1970. That's not very user-friendly. And you'll see that each of these functions takes a timestamp as a second argument, and that timestamp is just a simple Unix timestamp. We can take any timestamp we've created and drop it into that second argument. It's the format that's the tricky part and that we're going to have to learn more about. In fact, the functions may look identical, but what differentiates them is the format, and each function has its own format rules. Let's take a look at date first. The easiest way to show you the formatting options for date is to take a look at the php.net page for date. Go to php.net and do a search for date, and you'll get this page. And here are the different formats for the output string. Let's scroll down. Notice the format characters over here, D, capital D, lowercase j, and so on. And then it tells you what each code does. So for example, D is the day of the month, 2 digits with leading zeros, such as 01 to 31. And you'll notice that J is also the day of the month, but without leading zeros, 1 to 31. Capital D is a textual representation of a day, the 3 letters, Monday through Sunday, so WED for Wednesday, for example. Now we can scroll down a bit further on the page to see how these strings are used. The format is a simple string, but with the format characters as placeholders for each part of the date. When the date function is called, it will replace the format code placeholders with the actual data. So for example, this format string here will return the line right above it. Monday, the 8th of August, 2005, and then the time. Now in this example, they aren't passing in a timestamp, so it defaults to the current time. But in the example below that, you can see that they do pass in the timestamp as the second argument. They build the timestamp using maketime and then pass it in. Notice also that the format code that they're using in that second one is just simply an L, and that's it. And if we go and look at L, you'll see what it does is it returns the day of the week. So this will tell you what day of the week July 1st, 2000 is. Now that's a nice little trick. Not only are we able to format the data into something human readable, but we're actually able to find out some information about the calendar as well. Now personally, I don't use date, and I would recommend that you also use string for time instead. The reason why I like it better is that it's part of the Unix open standard, and it's used by many programming languages besides PHP, and has support for formatting dates in foreign languages as well. So let's take a look at the string for time format codes to see how they're different from the ones for date. So for example, if we look here at D, you'll see that there's a percent in front of it first of all. The percent helps make it clear that this is a format code. So all the string for time ones are going to be preceded by a percent sign before the code. So essentially, %d does the same thing that D did in the date function. But now take a look at %d with a capital D. You'll see that this is different. Instead of being the 3-letter code for the day of the week, it's going to be a shortcut for the month, day, and year as numbers with slashes in between them. And instead, if we look at A up here, you'll see that that is the abbreviated weekday name. So that's how we get that same functionality we had before. So some of them are going to be the same. M, for example, down here, the month as a decimal number, that's the same. But capital M and other ones like that are not. So there's a lot of differences. So you really have to learn each set of codes separately. And that's why I think you ought to pick one and stick with it. And I recommend you go with string for time. Now obviously this list here of codes on the string for time is a comprehensive list, and you may want to copy down the ones that you're going to use most often and make yourself a little cheat sheet. But you'll also get familiar pretty quickly with them, and you'll be able to remember the ones when you need it. So let's try this out now. I've still got my old window open for datetime Unix. Let's go ahead and do file save as on that, and we'll call this one instead datetime format.php. And I'll just change it up here to say formatting. And then we'll go ahead and clear out all the PHP we had there so we can start fresh. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just build a real simple timestamp with the current time. And we know how to do that with just time. And then let's make ourselves echo back the results of string for time. And we'll say the date today is, and let's put in our format codes. So %m. So the percent sign lets it know it's a code for string for time. And then the M tells it that it'll be the numbers for the month. And then we'll have %d and %y. And then last of all, we need to pass in, of course, our timestamp. Let's go back over to our browser and try that out. Instead of loading up Unix, I'll load up format.php. There we go. So today is November 1st, 2008. Now today is not actually November 1st for me. Instead, I set my system clock to that time so that I could show you something. Now earlier I pointed out the reasons why I like string for time better than date. But there's one feature that date has that string for time doesn't. Date has options for leaving off the leading zeros before a month or a day number. Now notice here I've got the 01. That's the leading zero that I'm talking about in front of it. We have the option to leave that off in date, and it could just simply be 11/1/08. And the same thing would be true if we were talking about January. String for time would print it as 01, whereas in date we have the option of leaving the leading zero off. And a lot of times we're going to want to get rid of those leading zeros. So I'm going to show you how you can do that by writing yourself a helper function. It's a little bit of a hack, but it is effective. So what we'll do here is we'll just take this line and we'll copy it down here. And instead of just sending in the formatting, we're going to put an asterisk in front of each of these two. Those are the two places where a zero may show up. So we're sort of marking the position where we want to watch for a zero. And we're doing that with this asterisk. Now, you can use any character you want. I picked the asterisk because it's something that I don't use very often when I'm formatting this kind of date. But you could easily use a different character if you needed the asterisk for another reason. So now let's write ourselves a helper function. Function strip zeros from date, and then we'll pass in marked string equals, and there we go. We'll pass in an empty string by default. And the first step is that we're going to remove the marked zeros. So no zeros will be equal to string replace, and we'll use string replace to look for every occurrence of an asterisk with a zero, and if we find it, eliminate both. Get them both out of there. And then we'll just need to pass in the marked string so it knows what to search through. And then once we do that, the last step is we'll remove any remaining marks, right? Because we don't want to have to deal with the case where we have something like December, which would not have a leading zero, and so we'd still have that asterisk sitting there because it didn't get removed. So we'll then do another step, cleaned string equals, and we'll do another string replace. But this time, we're going to be looking for any asterisk that's still left around, and we'll replace that with nothing, and we'll do that to our no zeros string. And finally, return back that cleaned value. So there we go. Now we have a function that should work for us. Let's just move this string for time down below the function so that it's defined. And we'll just put it around the whole thing. There we go. And I'll save it. And let's come back over. Let's try it out. And there we are. I didn't put a BR tag in there, but you can see this one does have the 01. This one did remove the 01. So most of my PHP projects, I go ahead and just port in a function like this that will help me to use string for time and to be able to get rid of those zeros. And I think it might be helpful to you too. The very last thing I want to show you here is that I can also format strings suitable for storage in MySQL. A lot of people wonder how you do this conversion. You don't want to just pass in a Unix timestamp to MySQL. You want to format it to something that MySQL can understand. Luckily, it's very, very easy to do. Let's do echo HR just to make a nice break there. And then we'll do a new dt equals time. That'll be dt for date time. And then what we want to get is MySQL date time. And the way we're going to do that is to do it using that string for time function. And we're going to put in the following formatting code. %Y, that's the year with all 4 digits. And then %M, %D, then a space, %H for the hour, %M for the minute, and %S for the second. There we go. And then, of course, we'll want to pass in that time we were just working with. So we could pass in any timestamp, and we're going to have it output with this formatting. That'll go into this MySQL datetime. And of course, if we want to see the results of that, then we'll just need to do an echo on it. There we go. So we'll come back, and there we are. That's the format that MySQL understands. So go ahead and write down those formatting codes. Make sure that you keep them handy for working with MySQL. But you also may want to just make a copy of this here just to show you what the result should be in case you end up using date or some other system, whatever. This is the format that MySQL wants for date time fields. Now, if it's just a date field, it'll just be the date part of that. But this is the format it's going to use. So now that we've learned to work with and format the dates and times, we're ready to move on. And in the next movie, we're going to look at server and request variables. In this movie, we're going to take a look at how we can retrieve and work with server and request variables. Now, we've already seen some super globals that we can work with, right? We saw get, post, cookie, and session. Well, there's one other one that I want to introduce you to, and that is server. And that's where we're going to be able to find all of these server and request variables is inside the super global for server. So what we're going to do is ask that super global to return a value to us for various information, like the server name or the remote IP address that made the request for this web page. A lot of times we'll want to keep track of that to know where the request came from, what the user's IP address is. And we can do that using this server super global. Let's try it out and see some of the things we can ask it for. I'm going to open up basic.html, and I'm just going to do a save as on it, and we'll call it server variables.php and put it in our B2B sandbox, and server variables. Now the first three that we'll take a look at will just be simply looking at information about the server that we're on. We can ask for our server's name, for our server's address, and for its port. Let's try those out and see what we get back and think about how you might use that information. We'll open up Firefox, and instead of going to date time, we're now going to go to server variables.php. So there's the information that I have for my server. Now, once you install this on a production machine, probably your server name will change, the port, the address, those things will all change. Because I'm using localhost, it goes ahead and resolves the server name to being localhost, and my IP address is just simply listed as 1. There are a few other things we can ask for. We can ask it for the document root on our server, where all our files are located. We can also ask it for details about the page that we're working with, right? So here's some page details. PHP self, that's a very useful way to find out what page this is, right? Server variables page. Or script file name. We can also pull that back. Let's take a look at those. I'll save that file. Let's just reload over here. Save the file. There we go. Reload it. So you'll see my document root. It tells me where the documents are located. And then the page details. It tells me the path to get to the page that's actually executing. And then the script file name, you'll notice, gives me the same thing, but it gives me from the root of the user's directory. PHP self is what's being typed into the URL bar, right? That's up here. The other one is actually the path on the file system. That's the script file name. So notice the difference between those two and make sure you use the right one in each context. If we want to redirect someone to a URL or something, we would use PHP self. But if we're trying to locate a file to include or require into our script, then we might want to use something like script file name or our document root, for example. Now, notice that document root here is actually not my user directory. That's because of the way that Apache is set up on a Mac system, so that my actual root of all of my web server is going to be in this library web server documents folder, not in each user folder. That's why I have to use this tilde and my username. And then perhaps most interesting to us, we can find out information about the request that comes in. So we'll switch back over here, and we can get details about the request. We can get the remote address that's asking for it, the remote port, the URI that they asked for, the query string if they asked for anything after the URL, the time it was made, the referrer, that's who referred them to our website. That's really useful for keeping track of links and finding out, did someone get to us by clicking on a link on Google, for example, or did they click on a link at Yahoo and that's how they found us? And then user agent, which is what browser they're using. So those are great for statistics and server tracking and that kind of thing. So I'll save that. We'll come back and we'll just do a reload. Now, of course, my remote address, since I'm doing it from the same server, is just going to be 1. But if we were to put this up on a server somewhere, then it would obviously pick up my IP address. Now, you notice that the query string is blank. Let's go ahead and just put in something here. And let's say, and q equals 1 and n equals 2. And you'll notice that now it pulls in the elements in that query string, and we're able to then work with those and parse those if we need to. Now, we also have access to those through the get superglobal. Those will be put there for us already, and that's basically what it's doing, is taking query string and parsing it for us. But if we needed direct access to it, or if we wanted to store it in the database and keep track of it or something, we could also do that by just looking at the query string. Now, there are a lot of other server variables. I think these are the most useful ones. If you want to go to the php.net website, it's a little tricky to find, but php.net/manual/en/reserved.variables.server.php. And that will give you all of those server variables that you can have access to. And you can look and see if there are any others that sound interesting to you, anything you want to play with. But I really think that the main ones are the ones that we just took a look at. There's one more thing that I want to caution you about. There's also a superglobal called request. Don't use request. When you're trying to get those request variables, you want to get them from the server superglobal. Request is a superglobal that basically just contains all of those post and get values that we already have access to through post and get. So it's a little bit redundant. If you want to find out the remote address of the request URI, do that through the server variable, not through the request superglobal. Now that you're not a beginner anymore, we need to talk about variable scope a little bit further, and specifically talk about global and static variables and what those can mean for us and do for us. We saw global briefly in the essential training, but I want to go into it again here and expand on it a bit to make sure that you understand what's going on. So I'm going to open up that basic.html again and just do another save as on it. And we'll call this one variable scope.php. Variable scope. Okay, we talked about local and global variables in the previous training. Just to refresh your memory, variables that are declared inside the PHP document are in the global scope. So if I just start declaring something like var equals 1, that is in the global scope. Variables declared inside a function have a local scope. So if I say, for example, function test1, and we'll go ahead and just declare a variable inside there, var equals 2, then that has a local scope. It's local to that function. And we can test this out by just having it echo out those two values for us. So var, and let's have it do br for us. And we'll take the same line and we'll just put it down here, but we'll also need to, of course, call the function test1. So if we try that out in a browser, and let's go to variable scope. Oops. It figured out the PHP for me. .php. There it goes. Now you notice that the first time the value is 2, and the second time it's 1. So even though we set the variable to 1, then we defined our function, which doesn't actually do anything, right? Doesn't execute anything. Then we execute the function here, which does set variable equal to 2, and we echo it out. That's the first 2 we're seeing. But then when it comes back and it echoes it again, it is echoing the variable that's in the global scope. So study that a little bit and make sure you understand the difference between local and global. Now we saw, though, in the essential training that we could also do it another way so that we could have access to that global value inside our local function. We'll just take this same thing again, and we'll come down here. Of course, I'll need to make it test2 so that we don't conflict with the previously defined function. But this time, the one difference I'm going to do is I'm going to call global and var. So what that does is it says, hey, you know that var in the global scope? That's what I mean when I talk about var. All references from var from here on out, I'm talking about that thing. It's like importing it into the local scope, but it retains it. So it just pulls it in so that we can work with it as a reference almost. So let's try that. Let's go back and let's load up our page again. Now you'll notice that var did change the second time. So this assignment here, var2, did take place to only the global scope. It brought in the global to the local, made the assignment, and that assignment stuck around. So again, study those two examples and make sure you understand what global is and why we use that global declaration before our variable to let it know that we want to use the global value. Now, the main reason I wanted to go over this and make sure that you understand it is not just so that you're comfortable in using it, but also because it leads us into talking about static variables. A static variable is a local variable to a function, but with one important difference. It doesn't lose its value when the function is done. So look back at test1. Typically, calling test1 will always yield the same value, 2. If we increment it, it's always going to revert back. To show you what I mean, I'm going to copy this whole thing again. And this time, I'll make it test3. There we go. And then I'll take out the global line for now. And once this whole thing is done, then let's do var plus plus, right? So that's just going to increment var. That's a shorthand to say var equals var plus 1. So it's going to increment it one time. Now let's try running this one and see what happens. So I'm going to run it, and it's 2 and 1, right? Just like it was before. Let's try running it a second time and a third time here. So I'm going to call it 3 times. Every time it's equal to 2, right? This incrementation that we did, it increments, right? So var is set to 2, it outputs 2, and then var is set to 3. And the next time we call it, var is equal to 2, var outputs, var gets incremented, it gets set to 3. But if we declare static in front of it, static var with a default value of 2, then when we call it every time, it increments 2, 3, 4. So notice it's still a local value, right? It didn't affect 1. That's on our global scope. It's still in the local scope, but it's a static value now that keeps its value and sticks around every time the function is called. So it works like a counter variable inside this function. Now, while we won't use static variables very often, it's a good tool to know about. But even more importantly, I want you to understand it so that you won't be confused when we talk about a slightly different application of the word static when we get to object-oriented programming a little later. There's going to be another use of the word static, and this is going to be helpful to have this as a foundation so that we can talk about that. A lot of beginning programmers get the two confused and aren't sure what the difference between them is, but that won't happen for us. In this movie, we're going to talk about references, specifically reference assignment. References are going to allow variables to refer to the same content as other variables. I'll open up basic.html and just do a save as on that. And let's save this as references.php. Reference assignment. So if we have, for example, a variable a, which is equal to 1, and then we have a variable b, which we set equal to a. Now if we set b equal to something else, like 2, then if we echo back those values for a and b, we can guess what they're going to be. It should returns 1/2. Let's try it out and see. I'll open up Firefox, and let's bring up references. There it is, 1 and 2, just like we would expect. But what if instead of doing that, we instead used a reference? And the way we use references is to put an ampersand after the equal sign. And that does what is called reference assignment. So now, instead of b being simply equal to the value of a, b references the same thing as a. So the bit of computer memory that's holding a's value, b is now pointing at that same thing. The easiest way to think about it is it's like when you make an alias in the Finder in a Mac, or when you use a shortcut on a PC, and you have a folder and you can make a reference or an alias or shortcut that allows you to get to that same folder. That's what we're doing here. We're making an alias to it. So now what happens when we set these values? So let's save it. I'll erase this because we don't know what it returns yet. And we'll hit reload, and we see that it returns 2 and 2. Now the reason why is because b points to a, so when we change the value of b, it changes a at the same time, because they point at the same thing. They are equivalent, b and a. So make sure that you understand that. That's what a reference is. Now why use references? Why not just use a, or make a copy of a? One of the main reasons is that we can delete our reference b, and a will still be there. Just like if we deleted a shortcut from our desktop, it doesn't mean that the folder that was there is completely gone. We've just erased that shortcut. So a lot of times we'll want to be able to have that kind of disposable link there that we can break and destroy, but still leave the underlying values intact. When we decide that we are ready to unset it, then we can just simply use unset b, and that will unset b for us. And then let's just echo those values back just to see what they're equal to again. And you'll see that now a is still equal to 2, but b is equal to nothing. So that's the basic concept behind references. We're going to look in the next few movies at other ways that we can make use of them. In the last movie, we learned about references and how we can have one variable that references the same value that another variable references. It works like an alias. Well, now I want us to look at how we can pass in references to functions so that the argument itself that's being passed in is a reference. Let me show you what I mean. Here I am in my references file that I was just working on. I'm just going to do a quick save as on that, and we'll just call this one references args, and that will help us keep them separate. And then we'll make the name of it references as function arguments. And we'll take everything we were working on and just take it out of there. Now let's write a real simple function here. Let's just say function, we'll call it ref test, and we'll pass in a variable. And in there, we're just going to do a real simple transformation to that variable, just so that we can see whether the value gets affected. You can just do +1 or something like that. I'm going to do ×2. And now we know that if I have a value like a, and then I pass in ref test a, and then echo back the value of a, stop and look at that for a second and tell me what you think the value of a will be. Remember what we know about local and global variables. Hopefully you were able to tell that a starts out as 10. The value of a gets passed into this function ref test as an argument. It gets multiplied by 2, but then nothing ever happens because this is a local scope. It's the local value, and a is a global value. So when we come back and we echo a has been unchanged. So let's just demonstrate that just to make sure that we're clear on that. It's the basic things we were talking about before with local and global values. So I'll open up Firefox, and instead of references, I'll just ask it for references args. There we are. Value is still 10. Not 20, but 10. So it did not change because this is the local scope. Now we saw in the last movie how we use ampersand with the equal sign for reference assignment. Well, we're going to use that ampersand again here, but this time we're going to put it in front of the argument. So it'll be like that. It'll be ref test, and then in parentheses, ampersand, $var. So what we're saying here now is when something comes in, don't take its value, make a reference to that value. So therefore, a and var are going to point to the same thing. Now let's watch what effect that has. I'll save this, and we'll go back and we'll reload the page, and now notice it's equal to 20. Okay, because var is pointing at that same thing as a. It's like an alias now. So in the same way that a shortcut or an alias on your computer, that's, let's say, an alias for a folder, if you drop a file into that folder, it both goes into the alias and into the actual folder. It exists in both places because they point to the same thing. So that's what's happening here. It's affecting that same value because they're both pointing at the same thing. Now if you stop and think about it for a second, this is exactly the same as if we had taken the ampersand out and just simply called global $a, and then simply made this a as well, right? No, we need to change this one too. Those have the same effect. Let's just try it, right? Exact same effect. In fact, we can actually not even pass in a value here if we're working with global. All right, so there's a little bit of a difference in that we don't have to pass in a value when we use global. When we're using the args version, we do, and we have the ability to name it something else. We don't have to have the same variable name as we had when we used global. So we're able to rename it in the local context, but have it still reference the same thing. So it's going to be a little bit up to you to decide whether you want to bring in a global value or whether you want to simply work with it as a reference. They're going to achieve a lot of the same things. It's just going to be syntactically a little bit different. So make sure you understand both of them, and then you'll be able to use whichever one feels right in each situation. In the next movie, let's look at how we can have functions return values that are references. In this movie, we're going to continue to talk about references. We've seen what references are, and we've seen how to pass them in as arguments to a function. In this movie, I want to take a look at how we can return references as return values out of a function. To start with, I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to use my references args file, and I'll just do a save as on that. And we'll call this references returns as function. We'll just say return values. Now I'll go ahead and get rid of all of the function I had there, and I'll write it in a new function. And it's going to be function ref return. And I'm not going to pass in any arguments to it, but instead I'm going to have a global value that I'll pull in, global a, and I'll use a and just do a simple transformation on it so we can see that it's changed. And last of all, return that value. And then I'll go ahead and set a equal to 10. And if I have b equal to ref return, right, then that should take whatever return value came back from the reference return, right? And it should put it into B. So in order to test this out, let's echo those out so we can see them. And I'm just going to do a real simple echo on those, and let's see what they're equal to. So I'll save that. We'll come back to the web browser, and we'll just do returns.php. Okay, so they're both equal to 20. It starts out a is equal to 10. Then we run this function, which brings in a as a global, changes its value. It's a global, so we're affecting that global value of a, and then it returns it to b, so b is also equal to 20. Fair enough. But now notice what happens if we say, well, b is equal to 30. Let's take that same line, and let's test that out. Now, b equals 30, and a equals 20, right? We're not using any kinds of references. So b is just a separate variable, and when we change its value, it doesn't affect a, right? Because we're not using any references. Now, we talked about reference assignment before, and we learned how to simply use the ampersand after an equals sign for a reference value. And that we used it before, we would say that b references a. Let's save this, and let's just try it here and see what happens. Nothing. Nothing changed. It gave us the same value back, right? Because it's returning a value to us. Now, it says return a here, but it's not returning the actual variable a. It's not returning a reference to a. It's returning the value, the same way as when we passed in arguments. And we said that we were going to have the first argument be passed in be a. Without that reference assignment, we were passing in the value of a, which was 10. So in this case, what we're returning is the value here, not a. Just be clear on that. It's returning the value. The number 20 is being returned, and that is being set up as a reference. B is referencing 20, which really is kind of meaningless for it to reference 20, right? It's equal to 20. It's the same thing. So in order for this to return a reference, we need to put another ampersand here at the beginning of the function name. So that's where it's going to go. It's going to let us know that we're returning it. It doesn't go down here. It goes up at the beginning of the function name, and it says return a reference value. Whatever return value comes out of here will be a reference. That means that what's being returned out of here is a reference. So that's returning, actually a is being returned. But if we don't have this one, then b is still just being set to the value of a, right? So we need both of them. It's important to have both so that the reference is being sent out of the function as a reference and it's being set to b as a reference. You have to have that handshake between the two. Otherwise, it won't work. So now let's try it. And let's reload it, and we see that now in the second line, a and b are both equal to 30. Because when I set b equal to 30 here, it also changes a at the same time because they're a reference. And we know how references work. We've seen that. So once again, if you need to play with it a little bit, try taking out the ampersand here and see what you get, and try taking out the ampersand here and see what you get. And you'll see that it doesn't work in either case. It's because we're passing out a reference, and then we're setting b to that reference. There's two steps to that process. So make sure you're clear on that. Before we move on, I just want to give you another example. I'm just going to skip down here, and I'll put another function, which I've called increment. And this one, instead of using a global variable, is going to use static variable, which is going to start out by initializing to 0, and then it will increment it by 1 and return that value. It makes sense. It's called increment. But it's going to return a reference to that static variable. So if we catch that value of increment in a, then the variable will increment. A will now be a reference to that increment. So therefore, if we call it a second time, just on its own, like that, what will the value of a be? A is still pointing to this static variable. When we call the function again, even though it's not doing any assignment, it increments that static variable. So a still points to it. Even more interesting is that we can increment it this way, because a points to the same thing as increment. So it's, once again, incrementing that static variable. So either one works. We'll do the same thing one more time. Increment. And then last of all, just so we can prove to ourselves that this has been working, let's do an increment. So last of all, just so we can prove to ourselves that this has been working, let's echo out the value, just so we can see what it is. So I'll save this, and let's go back and let's reload it, and you'll see that a is equal to 4. The first time it increments it, then it increments it again, and then again, 4 times. The static variable in there is just getting incremented, and we can do it either way because we've made a reference to a value inside this function. These reference techniques that we've been learning will become more useful later when we start working with object-oriented programming and with databases. We'll talk more about references after we talk about objects. Let's begin our discussion of object-oriented programming in the next chapter.